I was in the middle of a call with our biggest client when my brother walked through the front door of my clinic like he owned the place. Not knocked, not texted ahead. Just walked in, looked around at the waiting room full of patients, and smiled like he was returning to something that had always been his. I watched him through the glass partition of my office. My phone was still pressed to my ear. Doctor backed. Harmon from Medbridge was mid-sentence about the partnership terms we'd been negotiating for 6 months. 6 months of 5 a.m. emails and weekend calls and reworked financial models, and my brother was standing in my lobby adjusting his jacket cuffs. I told Dr. Jesding, Harmon, I'd call him back in 10 minutes. I hung up before he could respond. Here's what you need to understand about my family before the rest of this makes any sense. I grew up the second child and the only daughter in a house where my brother could do no wrong, and I could do nothing right. Not because I wasn't trying. I was the one who studied until midnight, the one who got into the honors program, the one who worked summers at a medical office for $12 an hour just to learn how it operated from the inside. My brother Nate was the one who showed up late to everything, failed out of pre-med twice, and still got the car for his birthday while I took the bus. My mother used to say, Nate just needs more time to find himself. She said it with a tenderness she never used when talking about me. She said it when he dropped out the first time and the second time, and when he got his girlfriend pregnant and then disappeared for 3 months. He always came back. She always received him like a prodigal son. I stopped expecting the same treatment around the time I turned 19. By then, I had already accepted that in our family, I was the background character, the useful one, the one you called when something needed doing and ignored when something needed celebrating. So I stopped needing their celebrations. I put myself through the rest of college working nights at a clinic in Buckhead. I applied to a physician assistant program on a Tuesday and didn't tell anyone until I was accepted. When I graduated, my mother said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but why didn't you go to medical school?" My father said nothing. He was watching the game. I started small. A leased office in a medical building in Midtown Atlanta. 1 exam room, 2 staff members, and a patient list that I built 1 referral at a time. I answered my own phones for the first 8 months. I cleaned the office on Friday nights because I couldn't afford janitorial service yet. I ate rice and beans more times than I can count and called it a business decision. 5 years later, Callaway Women's Health had 3 locations, a staff of 22, and a contract pending with Medbridge that would expand us to 2 more locations within 18 months. I had built something real, something mine. My family's reaction to all of this could be summarized in a single conversation I had with my mother, about 2 years in, when she asked me how the little clinic thing was going. I said it was going well, that we were profitable, that I was looking at a second location. She said, "Just be careful you don't burn yourself out, sweetheart. Maybe find a nice doctor to work under. It would be less stressful." I told her I was the doctor's employer. She changed the subject. The last time I had seen Nate before he walked into my clinic that afternoon was at Christmas, 3 years prior. He had called my work a hobby business. He said it in front of the whole table, with the casual cruelty of someone who doesn't realize how much it reveals about them. I had spent those 3 years building, not arguing. We hadn't spoken since. I hadn't attended the last 2 family gatherings. My mother called occasionally, never to apologize, always to guilt-trip me about tearing the family apart. I kept the calls short. I kept my life separate. It was the healthiest thing I had ever done. And then Nate walked through my front door. I came out of my office slowly. There were 6 patients in the waiting room. My office manager, Bree, was at the front desk with an expression on her face that I recognized immediately. It was the one she wore when something uncomfortable was happening that she didn't know how to handle. Nate saw me and spread his arms like he expected a hug. "There she is," he said, like I was a sight to see, like no time had passed. I said, "Nate, what are you doing here?" He said he needed 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. He had something important to discuss. He was smiling the whole time, and I noticed he was wearing a new suit. I hadn't seen him in a suit before. It didn't fit him right across the shoulders. I told him he could wait in the small conference room down the hall. I told Bree to make sure he didn't wander. Then I went back to my office, called Dr. Harmon back, apologized for the interruption, and finished the call. When I was done, I sat at my desk for a moment and breathed. Whatever was coming, I needed to be steady for it. He was seated when I came in. He had his hands folded on the table like a man preparing to pitch something. There was a manila folder in front of him that I didn't ask about. I sat across from him and waited. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he'd gone through some real personal growth over the past couple of years, that he'd taken some business courses, he said courses, and had been doing consulting work. He said he saw a real opportunity with what I had built here. I kept my face neutral. He said that what Callaway Women's Health needed was a male-led operational arm. His words. A male-led operational arm, to manage the administrative side of things, to bring in a more structured corporate culture, to position us for serious investors. He said the healthcare industry needed that kind of credibility. I said, "What kind of role are you proposing?" He slid the folder across the table. It was a proposal, typed, formatted, with section headers. Someone had helped him with it, that much was obvious. He had outlined a position for himself as Chief Operating Officer, 45% equity stake, full access to financials, veto power on major contracts, which, not coincidentally, would have included the Medbridge deal I had been building for 6 months. I read through it carefully. Completely. I turned each page without reacting. When I finished, I closed the folder and slid it back to him. I said, "Nate, what are your qualifications for this role?" He said he had the business courses and real-world experience. He'd been in the space recently. I said, "Which space?" He said healthcare-adjacent consulting. He said it like it meant something. I said, "Name a client." He shifted in his seat. He said that was confidential. I said, "Name your certification body." He said that wasn't the point. I said, "You're asking for 45% of a company I built while you were calling it a hobby. I'd like to understand what you're bringing to the table." He sat up a little straighter. He said, "Mom and Dad aren't doing well, you know. Dad's blood pressure. Mom's knee surgery coming up. I'm just thinking about the family." That sentence landed like a small explosion, quiet on the surface, destructive underneath. I said, "If our parents need help, I'm happy to discuss that separately. That's not a reason to restructure my company." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You know, people in this neighborhood talk. I've been doing some networking. Some of your referring physicians have been asking questions about your billing practices, just things I've heard." I looked at him. He said it casually, like it was a helpful warning. But it wasn't. I said, "This meeting is over." He said, "I'm trying to help you." I stood up, opened the conference room door and asked Bree to escort my brother out of the building. "I want to tell you that I went home that night and slept well. I want to tell you it rolled off me." It didn't. I lay in bed and ran through every version of what he meant by billing practices. Every physician who referred patients to my clinic. Every relationship I had spent years carefully building. I got up at 2 a.m. and pulled up my billing records on my laptop. I sat at my kitchen table and went through 3 years of documentation, not because I thought I had done anything wrong, but because I needed to know exactly where I stood before anyone else could try to claim otherwise. Everything was clean. I had always run a tight operation. But knowing that didn't stop the sick feeling of realizing what my brother was willing to do. The next few weeks were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Nate didn't contact me. My mother called once, but only to ask about my father's insurance and nothing else. I started to think maybe the threat had been empty bluster. Maybe he'd backed off. Then one of my referring physicians, a Dr. Ellens from a family practice across town who sent me a significant number of patients each month, called to say he'd received a letter. He wasn't sure how to raise it with me, but he thought I should know. The letter had been sent on what appeared to be official letterhead from a healthcare compliance consulting firm. It alleged that Callaway Women's Health had been engaged in irregular billing practices and suggested that physicians referring patients to us might want to consider the liability implications. The letter was signed by a consulting firm called Prescient Health Advisory Group. I had never heard of them. I thanked Dr. Ellens. I told him I was looking into it. I stayed calm on the phone. When I hung up, I sat very still at my desk and understood exactly what was happening. I had an attorney. I'd had one since my second year of business because I knew enough to know that I'd need one eventually. Her name was Diane Whitmore. I called her that afternoon. She pulled the registration on Prescient Health Advisory Group within 48 hours. It was a shell company, incorporated 6 weeks prior. The registered agent's address was a UPS store in a suburb east of Atlanta. The principal on the filing was a name I didn't recognize, but the secondary contact, listed, apparently through carelessness, was an email address I recognized immediately from years of family group texts. It was my brother's email. Diane said, "Well, that's helpful." I said, "Yes, it is." Here's the part that surprised even me. I had expected Nate to be reckless, but I had underestimated how much help he had. Over the next 2 weeks, Diane traced a chain of communication between the shell company and 3 of my referring physicians. All 3 had received versions of the letter. One had received a follow-up call from someone representing themselves as a compliance specialist, who suggested an in-person meeting to discuss their exposure. The specialist had used my brother's cell number. 2 of the physicians had already begun quietly redirecting their patient referrals. In addition to this, our review site I monitored as part of our patient outreach showed 5 new 1-star reviews posted within 10 days, each from accounts created within the previous month, each with a similar phrasing pattern that my office manager caught immediately because she'd been doing social media monitoring since we opened. The language was oddly formal, specific in the wrong ways, the kind of specific that reveals the person writing it wasn't actually a patient. I printed everything. Diane organized it. We had, in about 3 weeks, built a documentation file that was, in her words, more than sufficient. My mother called on a Tuesday. I hadn't reached out. I was waiting. I knew, from the way our family operated, that eventually someone would call to negotiate. They always did. The pattern was, my brother would create chaos, my mother would call to smooth it over, and the expectation was that I would accommodate in the name of family peace. She said she'd heard I was having some difficulties with my business. She said she hoped it wasn't too serious. She said Nate had mentioned he'd offered to help, but that I had been cold to him, and it had hurt him very much. I let her talk. I had learned to do that. Then I said, "I need to ask you something directly. Did you know what Nate was doing?" She paused. Then she said, "He's just trying to be involved. You've always shut him out." I said, "He created a fraudulent consulting firm and sent defamatory letters to my referring physicians. I have documentation. I have the registration records. I have his contact information on the filing." Silence. She said quietly, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." I said, "It's not. Diane has already drafted the cease and desist. I wanted to give you the opportunity to hear this from me first, as a courtesy. The letter goes to Nate's address tomorrow morning." My mother said, "You would really do that to your own family?" I said, "He did it first." She started crying. I had expected that too. It used to work on me, completely and immediately, the way it works on most people who grew up the way I did. But I had spent years, quietly and without anyone watching, unlearning the reflex. I could hear her cry and feel something, sadness even, without letting it change what I knew was true. I said, "I love you, Mom. This isn't about you and me, but I've worked too hard for too long to let this go." I let her speak for another minute. Then I told her I had a patient. The cease and desist went out the next morning. Diane sent copies to the 3 physicians as well, with a letter clarifying the origin of the communications they had received and the fraudulent nature of the consulting firm. 2 of them responded within 48 hours to say they were reinstating their referral relationships and appreciated the transparency. The 3rd took another week, but eventually came back as well. The 5 fake reviews were reported to the platform with the documentation Diane compiled. 4 were taken down within 10 days. The 5th took 3 weeks and a formal escalation, but it went too. Nate did not respond to the cease and desist personally. His attorney, and it turned out he had retained one somewhere along the way, sent a reply that was mostly bluster. Diane told me not to worry about it. I trusted her. The MedBridge partnership was not derailed. I called Dr. Harmon the week after the cease and desist went out and gave him a brief factual summary of what had occurred. Not the family details, just the business-relevant facts about an attempt to interfere with our referral network that had been addressed through legal channels. He appreciated the directness. He said it actually made him more confident in how I ran my operation. We signed the partnership agreement 11 days later. 2 new locations. 18-month rollout. Everything I had been working toward. My father called me about 2 months after all of this. Not my mother. My father, which had never happened in my adult life that I could remember. He didn't apologize, he wasn't built for that. But he said, "I hear you're expanding." I said yes. He said your grandfather would have liked that. That was all. It was so small. But I had not heard anything like it from him in 30 years, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes after the call. Not crying exactly, but not crying either. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. This story isn't about revenge. I know the word is satisfying and I understand why people reach for it. But what I actually felt, watching the cease and desist go out and the partnership get signed and the referrals come back, wasn't revenge. It was something quieter. It was the feeling of having built something that couldn't be taken from me. Not because I fought hard enough in the moment, but because I had spent years making it structurally sound. The reason my brother's scheme failed was not because I outmaneuvered him, it was because I had kept clean records since day one. Because I had retained legal counsel early. Because I had built actual relationships with my referring physicians, so when doubt was introduced, I had enough trust in the bank to survive it. You don't build that in a crisis. You build it on ordinary Tuesdays when no one is watching. My mother still calls. The relationship is what it is, managed, cordial, bounded. I don't expect it to become something it has never been. But I no longer need it to. I've stopped waiting for my family to see me clearly. I have staff who depend on me, patients who trust me, partners who respect the work. A 5th location in the planning stages. I don't know what Nate is doing now. I don't ask. I wish him something. Not exactly well, not exactly poorly. I wish him the kind of reckoning that comes quietly, in private, when you finally have to look at who you are and what you've done. I had that reckoning early, alone in a way no one saw. It made me who I am. That, more than anything, is what the clinic is built on. I've thought a lot about what actually happened, not just the legal part, not just the cease and desist or the partnership signing or the referrals coming back. I mean what really happened underneath all of it. Nate didn't fail because I outplayed him. He failed because he had spent his entire life being handed things, and when you've only ever been handed things, you genuinely don't understand what it costs to build them. He looked at my clinic and saw something to take. I looked at it and saw every Friday night I spent cleaning the floors myself, every patient I called back personally at 8 p.m., every decision I made carefully because I knew no one was going to catch me if I got it wrong. That gap, between someone who builds and someone who takes, is not a gap you can close with a suit that doesn't fit and a folder someone else typed up for you. It shows. It always shows. I used to think the hard part was the work itself, the early mornings, the financial stress, the years of being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me. But the real hard part was something no one prepares you for. Learning to hold your ground when the people you love are the ones applying the pressure. That takes a different kind of strength. Not louder. Not angrier. Just steadier. The kind of steady you build slowly, privately, in the moments when it costs you something. There's a thing I noticed about integrity, real integrity, not the word people put on office walls, which is that it is most useful precisely when you need it most. I didn't have to scramble when Nate made his threat about billing practices because I had kept clean records for years before anyone was looking. Diane didn't have to work hard to defend me because there was nothing to defend against. The threat had nowhere to land. That's not luck. That's the return on 1,000 decisions I made when no one was watching and no one was going to reward me for it. Moral clarity isn't something you summon in a crisis. You either have it built in already or you don't. And building it in requires all the ordinary, unglamorous choices. Being honest in the paperwork, being fair to your staff, not cutting corners when cutting corners would be so easy that no one will ever applaud you for. And the intelligence piece. Not raw intelligence, but the kind that comes from paying attention, from reading a room, from understanding that Nate's casual mention of billing practices was not a warning but a move that came from years of taking my work seriously enough to understand it completely. You can't be manipulated by something you've already mapped. Nate had one play. I had documentation going back 3 years. That's not cleverness. That's what it looks like when someone has actually been doing the work. Dr. Harmon told me afterward that what made him confident in signing was not that nothing had gone wrong. It was how I handled it when something did. Calmly, transparently, without drama. I think about that a lot. The quality of how you move through a hard thing says more about you than the hard thing itself. My clinic has a 5th location in planning now. My brother is somewhere east of Atlanta. My mother still calls and I still answer. And we talk about surface things in the careful way of people who have chosen to maintain a relationship without pretending it's something it's not. I don't carry bitterness about any of it. I'm not sure I ever really did. What I carry instead is a clear-eyed understanding of what I'm made of, and the knowledge that I know because I was tested and I held. That's worth more than their approval ever would have been.